it's really lovely to be here and to meet you all. Thank you to Sigrid and Dominic and Hannah for inviting us and putting this all together. I have tweaked my title as advertised. It's now Lonely Together from Glasgow to Saturn. The original title, From Glasgow to Saturn, comes from the title of a poetry collection by the late, great Edwin Morgan, a Glasgow poet and former professor at our institution at the University of Glasgow. And as the title indicates, the point of that collection was to stress that you can write, imagine, creatively explore the universe from where you happen to be. And so that was this gesture from Glasgow to Saturn. And it's also become the title for the Glasgow University sort of students' literary magazine as well, as if to reinforce that point. But I wanted to add this thing about loneliness and togetherness because it's a theme through the texts I'm going to focus on today. Because I want to focus not only on the variety and extent and scope of the Scottish literary imagination beyond, tartan and shortbread and heart disease, to the furthest reaches of the universe, but also perhaps to think about how the literary imagination navigates our isolation and our loneliness and perhaps gives us imaginative ways to connect with one another. So one of the main featured texts I'm going to talk about today is very specifically a study in kind of 21st century loneliness, which I hope when I speak more about it later you'll recognise why we thought it might speak to sort of teenage disaffection in the classroom. So when we teach Scottish literature in our institution at Glasgow, ours is the only university department solely dedicated to teaching research in Scottish literature anywhere in the world of this sort. The only autonomous kind of academic unit like that has all these programs and everything. Perhaps with the exception of the Scotland Hub here, being the only other type of organisation of that sort. So it's not that Scottish literature isn't taught elsewhere, of course. It's just that it's very often in English literature programs. It's folded into those programs in the ways that Dominic suggested earlier on. So when we talk to prospective students, we have to kind of orient ourselves towards that, because even students who've come up through the Scottish system won't necessarily have studied something that they think of as discretely Scottish literature. So the way I try to locate it is to suggest, and this is only my take on it, that if literary studies is the study of the ways in which our species imagines itself through language, and English literary studies is the study of the ways in which our species imagines itself in a kind of Anglophone tradition, in variations of the English language. Now the Scottish, in Scottish literary studies, isn't doing the same work as the English in English literary studies. Scottish literary studies, the studies of the ways in which our species imagines itself through language, in, through, or otherwise associated with this particular territory on the planet that we happen to call Scotland at the moment and for a few centuries now. So that it's writ large, right? Then it can contain multitudes, if you like. To reinforce that point again, when I'm introducing the subject to prospective students, I try to give some examples. So not only from Glasgow to Saturn, to give that idea of scope and scale, but other examples from another Glaswegian writer, for instance, Alan Spence, the poet and novelist. I'm going to recite a poem now. You ready? The title is On the Oneness of Self and the Universe. Okay, on the oneness of self and the universe. And it goes like this. It's all one to me. That's it. So it's from a collection called Glasgow Zen, so you get the kind of idea here. But that's, at a spiritual or cosmological level there, the reach of the Scottish literary imagination is endless. Another example from the late great sci-fi writer Ian M. Banks, A History of the Universe in 3 chapters. You ready? Chapter 1, bang! Chapter 2, Chapter 3, crunch. The end. So there, the entire history of the universe is, of course, contained in Scottish literary culture. That's my premise, anyway. Another visual example here is from a poet I'm fascinated by at the moment, who was a child prodigy who wrote fairy poetry in the 1920s, was a daughter of the manse, her father was a Presbyterian minister, and she sort of disappeared from the record. She later reappears as part of the San Francisco Renaissance. She's pals with Allen Ginsberg and Robert Duncan and Jack Spicer and all these guys, and she starts dabbling in collage, and this piece is called Bonnie Charlie's Gone Awa, and has part of an advert for a whiskey liqueur that has an image of Bonnie Prince Charlie of the Jacobite Rebellion pasted onto a photograph from atomic bomb testing in the mid-1950s. So this is the kind of angle of Scottish literature that I'm particularly interested in. This thing kind of piled with anachronism, with experimental kind of imaginations that tumbles modern histories and older histories into one another, and that speaks to the constructedness of our literary cultural heritage. Okay, I'll move on from there. The first text I wanted to speak to is one that we have taught in our first year undergraduate program, but one that I think would translate quite well into a secondary level classroom. And it speaks to the thorniness and the problem of the national paradigm writ large. So this is the book here, the first edition of it. It's called The Book of Scotlands by Momus. Momus is a moniker, of course. The character behind it is a man called Nick Curry, who was a kind of avant-garde synth pop musician from the 1980s. His music is I was looking him up recently. His latest album, he describes its genre as sinister, easy listening. So he's that kind of guy. But anyway, this work here, The Book of Scotlands, comes out in 2009. This is only 2 years after Minister we just heard from, Angus Robertson's party, become the minority Scottish government in the devolved Parliament, and so the prospect of an independence referendum as something other than a pipe dream, as something that might have a political reality, first enters into our political discourse in Scotland. And as an artist, Momus decides that it's incumbent upon him, in that context, to imagine possible and impossible Scotlands, to let his imagination run wild. And so he provides a series of 150-odd alternative Scotlands. And this is published by a German publisher, by Sternberg Press, Berlin. And it is a kind of art piece, but it has another life, which I'll get to in a moment. So when we teach a book like this that features these experimental, mind-bendingly reimagined Scotlands that absorb other national histories, that are pure sci-fi, some that are very gross and gory and explicit, others that are just a one-line joke, some that experiment with alternative cultural histories and what have you. It's a dense thicket of all sorts of kind of variously imagined Scotlands. But in here, as a taught text, we can use it to think of the nation as a contested space. We can use it to think about a longer history of how the nation as a concept has been culturally deployed, how it's been constructed by writers, how those ideas have had currency and then become manifest, become real in a sense, and how various artistic or political movements have made use of the cultural notions that attach themselves to the nation. So we can think of literary texts as belonging to the moment of their creation when we look at a text like this from 2009, and to a kind of posterity that they can't really anticipate, because of course a text like this lands differently. A few years later, there is an independence referendum in 2014. The vote that comes back is a sort of narrow margin against independence, and so this becomes part of a political and cultural history of an imagined set of Scotlands that wouldn't arrive according to the timeline that was imagined at that point, but then still has a cultural afterlife. So even after the referendum, this book is reissued and has another kind of life to it. And of course it belongs to a longer history of writers imagining alternate constitutional arrangements and possible Scottish statehood. It also speaks, I think, in a classroom setting to the power of narratives in all sorts of forms, because the first cover has this kind of Orwellian font, as if it's a kind of a government public announcement. Every lie creates a parallel world, the world in which it is true. This, I think, is a good, it's a playful and I think at least partially useful rule of thumb, I think, for approaching a literary text, right? If you come across one of his little fragments, little imagined Scotlands, or any of the poems or stories that we're going to talk about over the course of the day today, if you take it in a classroom setting again, if your students take it on its own terms as a blueprint for an entire universe and imagine their way into it and start extrapolating just from what they have on the text before we get to context and intent and effect, then I think it can share something with that, and it plays with the idea of political discourse as full of lies and mistruths and falsehoods, but at the same time they are conjuring up a kind of reality that might then become manifest, so it's not quite as simple as lies versus truth. And I think we can plug that back into ideas about, especially in the classroom, not just on the national scale, right, but ideas about how we narrate our own lives, our own day, for instance, right? That narrative is a kind of manipulation always, and that doesn't make it inherently deceitful, it just carries truth differently, perhaps, than other modes of linguistic expression, right, in a scientific or legal context, for instance. So, it's part of a much more complicated picture of manifesting kind of hopes and fears and charting those. Okay, incidentally, the playfulness of the cover as well, he's calculated the Pantone, that is the like categorized colour of the blue of the saltire, inverted the flag and then made the cross itself the exact opposite of this blue, which turns out to be this shade of orange. So again, it's a kind of playful inversion of expectations throughout. This is the cover of the second edition, and here are some examples from in the book. I've also shared a handout, I hope that you guys will have access to, that has another few entries, another few Scotlands from the collection. There are also more that are available online in sample, so I can't give a whole version of this book to you guys, but it's such a fragmentary, experimental kind of form that if you have a handful of examples, you have enough to sort of teach the concept and to think about it. So here's a handful here. Scotland 104. The Scotland in which cities are broken up and the entire population lives on the land in equidistant crofters' cottages. So here we're reversing and playing with ideas about the Highland clearances, about the sort of social engineering of the population, the movement of peoples, this idea that you can apply a kind of almost imperialistic kind of rationale to the landscape, right? Well, you'll have your croft there and you'll have yours there and they'll all be equidistant and that's how we're going to get along from here. This idea that we could abstract ideas from Scottish history and apply them in an absolute and absurd way to help show up some of the contingencies of this history. Scotland 68, the Scotland overrun by gigantic spiders, which can only be killed by chemical sprays hosed from the back of 1950s lorries. So here is Scotland as 1950s creature feature, kind of B-movie horror film, right? But again, I think implying certain anxieties about the atomic age, about industrial byproducts, and about the idea of contagion and decay, which are, you know, certainly well embedded in our 20th century imaginary. Scotland 145, Scotland in which, this is my favourite, in which there is no repetition, no two houses are alike, nobody has the same name as anybody else, there are no habits. Every television show is seen just once and no website visited twice. If you've used a word before, you have to make up a new one. So this idea of a frictionless Scotland that doesn't have a history, because to have a history you need to use the same words to describe things over time, right? At least within reason. And here this is just a perpetually propelled Scotland, always emerging into its newness with no memory of its past, shorn of everything that we might associate with the cultural signifiers of Scottish nationhood. You know, whether that is a romantic landscape, a stag on a hill, a piece of tartan, Cayley shortbread, what have you. And it speaks to a kind of media age that I think is familiar to us as well. It asks us to reflect on the fact that we inscribe our identities individually, collectively, through repetition, right? And I mean, maybe this isn't sort of secondary school classroom level, but I always think also of Freud's repetition compulsion here, right? That this is an idea about us revisiting our original traumas over and over again, right? When we try to think of locating ourselves in the world. Finally, Scotland 75 is Scotland in which all food is soup.
That's true.
Yeah, that one's true. Yeah, that one's not made up. That one's true. But the thing is, they exist out of sequence in this book. They're not in order, you know, in sequential order. They're all mixed up. But if you flick through from Scotland 75, you do eventually find Scotland 74, another one which is true, is Scotland in which no one has any teeth. And so it starts to make a kind of sense to put the thing back together here, right? Nobody has any teeth and all food is soup. The second edition here, you can see, is published almost as if to trick consumers into thinking it's some kind of guidebook. And I love the idea that there might be somebody with their backpack on, ready to go to Loch Ness or somewhere, and thinks, well, I'll pick up a wee guidebook here. And they open it up and they're reading about, you know, nuclear spiders or whatever, instead of where to get the best Cullen skink in Fife or whatever, you know. So, but this, again, it speaks to the constructiveness. It has a bare, barren bit of Highland landscape, you know, that is barren because of the sheep and the clearances and commercial interests, and has a barcode stamped over it, interrupting that image as well. Incidentally, I didn't mention, but part of Momus's literary background is as a really early kind of figure in the blogosphere. We don't really talk about that anymore. It's a kind of older age of internet discourse, I think. But he was a very early practitioner in using the internet as a place for curating kind of avant-garde artistic practices. So when I've taught the Book of Scotland's, one of the things that has worked very well is, again, to give this historical context, setting out political and cultural contexts for Momus and his project, discussing how other writers and artists have responded to political devolution, to the cause of independence, especially around the referendum in 2014, because there are a great many writers, some of whom will be mentioned today, who have experimented with precisely this idea of the way critics went on to describe it as kind of inventing a parliament of poets or books before there was a parliament of politicians with legislative powers. Now that story is complicated and is rightfully, I think, challenged in some circles, but the point is that there is a literary culture that is trying to do the work of politics, whether or not it succeeds. It's worth thinking about in these terms. So we would close read one or two of these little experimental Scotlands, and even the silly ones, I think they merit going over and trying to sit down and do that kind of Richard's kind of critical analysis, just isolating that text and going from there to see what you can extrapolate and infer from it. All right, well, if Scotland's just covered in nuclear spiders, right? Or there's another one where Scotland decides to nuke itself back to the Stone Age to make a nice car park for England, for instance. Or one where there are Scotland suddenly becomes shares like the United States history or Iraq's history, or it has different parts of global history transplanted into it. Now, if we think about it in those terms, what is suggested by those parallels? On the surface, silly though they might be, what is actually being implied about the cultural inheritance, about the histories and the dynamics of power that Scotland has been plugged into as a major contributor to empire, for instance. So we can read, I think, into that even from the shortest, silliest examples, and we can wonder, in general terms, I think, about the role of the artist in society. What do students think the role of the artist is? Is it just to entertain? Is it to challenge us and confront us with things we don't want to look at more directly, right? In this context, a way that I've done a method I've discovered to sort of teach this is to put Momus's Book of Scotland's, full of its fantastic phantasmagoria and imagined Scotlands, next to the Scottish Government's white paper on independence around the time of the independence referendum. So this was a big PDF, big published book that set out exactly what independent Scotland would look like if, as they were trying to convince people to, they would vote yes to Scottish independence 11 years ago, right? We can pick out from that document how much continuity is insisted upon. Lots and lots of that document is about how this new horizon, this new Scotland, don't worry, the Queen's not going to go anywhere. This is before she past, obviously. We'll still have the monarchy. Don't worry, the currency will be the same. Don't worry, like your mortgage payments won't be affected. Don't worry, this will be the same. Don't worry, that will be the same. These institutions will be carried over. And so this speculative imagined Scotland looks almost exactly the same as the one that we're living in, right? Put that next to Momus's Book of Scotland's, which is full of giant geese that fly over and block out the sun for 6 months, or nuclear spiders or whatever else. What is the different function of these equally imagined prospective Scotlands? And so we can think about the artist in his proper context there. The other thing we've done in the classroom is to ask students to make up their own alternative Scotlands. And this, you have to do it quite delicately, because what inevitably comes up, and I'm sure it would land differently in a German classroom, but to be asked to imagine another place, right? But in a Scottish classroom, one of the things that comes out is when you ask the students to imagine alternative Scotlands, they, despite themselves, always show you their hopes or fears, right? Like, even if they're just trying to make people laugh, there's a kind of anxiety underneath it that you can read quite into it. So you've got to deal with it delicately, because sometimes people, without meaning to, tell on themselves a little bit when you let their imagination run free like this. But I think that, even if you can navigate it delicately, can be very useful in a kind of pedagogical setting to say to it, right, well, what does it mean to imagine a future for this place? It means something very, very personal. This isn't about the abstraction of statecraft. It's about what it is to live a life in the world. So I think you can get to some quite important and interesting places here. This is near the middle of the book. We have this mirrored, reflected version of Scotland, a silhouette of Scotland facing itself across the page, again to kind of very direct visual metaphor to reinscribe the idea of the book. So the context in which my colleague Dr. Young and I are here to discuss these things is that we are part of a project with the Scottish Qualifications Authority, who oversees Scottish qualifications and education, and they have been revisiting the set texts on the national curriculum, the Scottish texts that teachers have to choose from when they set texts in their classroom. And this is at the kind of upper level of secondary school. So this is sort of 14-year-old to 18 years old, I would say. So it was established, more than 10 years ago anyway, that these set texts would be Scottish set texts. And they have just been refreshed and changed for the first time recently, and we're involved in the kind of consultation process. So the mission statement they gave themselves, the SQA, was to more fully reflect life in Scotland in their choices of texts. Okay? So this meant a big public consultation, speaking to teachers, young learners, pupils, public bodies, charities, universities, folk like Ronnie and I, researchers, writers, editors, publishers, unions, and it was open to public submissions as well. So they got thousands of suggestions. And of course, as you might imagine, lots of them are from overworked teachers being like, I've just created resources for these set texts, please don't get rid of them. Totally understandably. So these priorities have to be balanced. Again, what kind of text might be successfully taught in Orkney as they might be in Dumfries or Glasgow or Edinburgh or Falkirk or wherever else, right? And across different ability levels. So you'll understand, I'm sure yourselves, the kinds of things that need to be taken into account when designing a curriculum. But one of the upshots of this process has been that there are more women, more minoritized writers now on the curriculum, more queer and non-binary writers, more working class writers, more care experienced writers. And as a result, there's a bigger variety in literary form and genre, as well as the kind of background of the contributing authors. So this is a great success, I think, to get that kind of representation in there, and that was one of the things that came back from the public consultation, is that teachers and pupils alike wanted to find something that they could attach themselves to, right? So at the upper level, for people who are choosing to do, in the Scottish system, it's called the Higher English, they might have a kind of vested interest, right? These are folk who want to study English to the highest level you can at secondary school. And so we can think about what kinds of texts that they would do best to have some exposure to. But at the level beneath that, that's the level of English that like almost everyone in the education system has to have access to. And so it needs to be about bringing as many people into that process and trying to encourage them to read and think critically and engage with literary text like that. And so these things have an influence over the choices as well. So one of the upshots is that for the first time, ballads, for instance, sit next to modern and contemporary poems. Traditional oral folk tales sit next to contemporary flash fiction and horror short stories. So there's more genres represented. And I think some of the most urgent challenges of this 21st century are addressed in ecology, in technology, and politics, are represented through historical and contemporary texts alike. I know Ronnie's going to speak to some of these issues a bit later, but this is, I hope, making the study of literature really like urgent and pressing in the classroom. So the challenge that we've got now with this new set of set texts is to help produce resources. And so we've been working with teachers in Scotland to put those together. And one of the texts I'm really pleased to see on the curriculum is one that I've also taught before, is a short story, again, which I hope will be available to you guys on PDF. And it is available on the S3A website. All the relevant links I've got in my slides, and I know those are going to be shared with you. But it's called A Voice Spoke to Me at Night, and it's from this 2018 collection, Mayhem and Death, which is more uplifting and beautiful and affecting and even funnier than it sounds from the title. But this is a collection of mostly flash fiction, very, very short form fiction. And so again, like Momus, this is a writer who is emerging from a kind of digital literary economy, okay? So McClory was publishing flash fiction on online magazines long before she got a publishing contract. So it's a very condensed form. It means these texts are like quite mobile, quite useful to teach because you can do them in a couple of sessions. This piece, when it's printed out on day 4, is like 4 or 5 pages. It's not very much. So you can cover it all in one session, at least superficially, and then get into the weeds with follow-up sessions after that. And again, as I mentioned, it's a study in loneliness across time and possibility of connection. So the collection is full of the kind of apocalyptic imagination, something that I think is a distinguishing feature of the early 21st century in its literary imaginary, right? Especially in the context of climate collapse and the economic turmoil and in global conflict. So one of the things that I think is interesting to isolate here is to face that, not just in a kind of hand-wringing way that might upset or intimidate young learners, but to try to grasp it in a more forthright manner and in a more playful manner, perhaps. So another piece of context I didn't mention before about Helen McClory is that one of the first big collections of hers that did make a big splash had a very similar conceit to the Book of Scotland's. It was called the Goldblum Variations, a riff on the Goldberg Variations. But the Goldblum Variations is a collection of tiny flash fictions that imagine Jeff Goldblum, the actor, in various wild and fantastical and alternate reality settings. Okay? So again, it's this very condensed flash fiction experimental form. But here she turns to perhaps more serious subject matter, but I think still has the same kind of playful spirit with it. Margaret Atwood described her work as shiny, dark, licorice mind candy. So I think that's a pretty good vote of confidence. And when corresponding with McClory about this story and getting it on the national curriculum, she wrote to me to say that it was her aim in that story to speak across the void between people. And I hope too that some of the teens who read it might find something of themselves within it. And again, in the context of this collection is dedicated to the lonely and the lost. So this specific story is narrated by an unnamed protagonist who lives a lonely life in a flat above a Tesco Metro, above a little convenience store. At night, they're unnamed and they're not gendered in the story either, so we don't know their gender. They begin to hear a voice speaking in another language, and eventually a figure appears in the mirror next to their bed, a man from the past, and he speaks a kind of hybrid Scots and Latin, which the narrator can't understand. but records on their phone and later translates. The man reveals he's the last survivor of a plague in his village and details how he lives there alone after this loss. Neither the unnamed narrator nor this figure from the past can break through this mirror to reach one another. And eventually the image in the mirror fades. The narrator reflects on the interaction, hoping that they were good company for someone who had been alone so long. So that's the bare bones of the plot, and it can remove some of the magic, but I wanted to give you a sense of it. So the story begins like this. It runs from the title straight into the first line. So a voice spoke to me at night. I don't know why it did. I live in a new build house above a Tesco Metro. This part of town seems to be historyless. I think before they built the flats there was an auto garage, and before that, I don't know, maybe something brownfield. Brownfield's a technical term of like local authorities. It's part of it's a site that had been used for commercial or industrial use but has been left to kind of rot. It's a kind of it's unused but is perhaps tainted by its previous use. Okay. Maybe something brownfield. But the voice that spoke to me was from someone from years and years in the past. I guessed because I didn't fully understand it. I read a bit of Chaucer in school, a medieval English poet, and it reminded me of that, a little bit gibberish, and some I could get. The voice had a Scottish character to it, though not like any dialect I could pick out. On the first night and for 2 nights after, it was just a voice. I went to bed at the normal time for me, which is about 10, and took my phone into bed and scrolled through the news and some football sites I like and Twitter until I was too tired to read straight, and then listened to a podcast about a crime and then one about food to calm me down. I like to be cosy with all the blankets around me, especially my feet, because I have a terrible fear that something will come and drag me by the ankles if I leave them exposed. This and the mirrored sliding doors of my built-in wardrobe are 2 things which unsettle me when I'm trying to sleep. I never liked the empty space of the mirrors taking up so much of my room, even before this happened. And now I can't stop thinking of them. Everything a mirror is, and everything it isn't. I'm trying to be honest here. I'm not a brave type. So the story opens before the narrator details the rest of this relationship. So it's a faltering, self-doubting kind of narration, an ambiguous setting, a sense of historylessness that I think is very familiar to us in the 21st century. The narrator's daily routine seems to be a kind of management of anxiety and loneliness. They're very unsure about their place in their work, which seems to be a kind of humdrum, kind of administrative, office-based kind of role. When they first hear this voice coming from their mirror, they're looking for soothing reasons that might explain it away, right? They're like, oh, it's the neighbours, they're watching some history documentary or something, or, oh, it's my phone and I've left it on a YouTube video or something. They're gathering reasons that all contradict one another, but if they can gather enough of them, they won't have to face the fact that this genuinely supernatural thing seems to have happened. They use cultural associations to puzzle this experience out, and some of it is things from school, right? So I've read a bit of Chaucer, so I recognise this is old language, right? The voice sounds croaky, like it belongs to a smoker, but our narrator remembers that tobacco arrived with the potato, with Sir Francis Drake, in whatever year, and that seems too late. So it can't be that, it must be something else that has made his voice hoarse. The narrator thinks of a walk-through YouTube video of a strategy computer game to recall, through all that indirectly, ideas about medieval history. The walk-through video of someone playing a kind of world-building civilizations or settlers kind of computer game, that is the route through that we have to take to identify with this historical epoch. They think, they go through Tinder, not to make any big decisions, but just to find faces to look at, to feel less alone. Again, that recalls the mirror. They're a big fantasy reader, and so they've heard fantasy uses the names of medieval European history very often to name its characters and places. And so again, the narrator knows something of this world through this accumulated cultural history. The explanations all, of course, eventually fall away, and our narrator is left with this dilemma, which follows us through lots of Scottish literary history, not least Jekyll and Hyde, for instance, right? Is this really happening, and therefore I'm not mad? That's a stressful eventuality. Or am I mad, and it's all in my head? Also a stressful eventuality, right? Neither explanation brings much comfort. There's this faltered delay in the relationship between our speaker and the figure in the mirror. They start recording him on their phone so that they can translate it later online. They can't understand in real time. So the suggestion being that history is right there. It's all around us. It's under our feet. It's everywhere. But we can't quite know it firsthand. We can't quite step into it. That barrier is very persistent. There are differences between our speaker and this figure in the mirror in their conceptions of death. This figure from the past talks about this village hit by the plague. Their loved ones are all gone. Talks about death standing over those on their way out with its long, soft wings resting on the figures of the dead. And that is an alienating piece to translate for our speaker when we get to it. They have differences in religious belief. Our unnamed narrator belongs to a kind of secular milieu. Our figure in the mirror is constantly invoking God. They have different ideas about sin, about knowledge, about their social order. The figure in the mirror has moved into the big house because the laird, the landowner, has died. And he's very anxious about being judged by God for doing that because that's not the natural order of things. But he had to go there to survive, and he was trying to read through the laird's library. The narrator comes to a kind of conclusion that loneliness, to trying to explain how this sequence of events came about. Loneliness is a terrible thing, wherever you are. And of course that's what's being reflected on either side of this mirror. A very material loneliness of being the lone survivor of a plague in medieval Scotland. And an everyday figure in a wee flat above a Tesco Metro in the 21st century in Scotland, with all sorts of technological and cultural apparatus to mediate between you and the world, but very little community, very little direct engagement. So here's the quotation. Loneliness is a terrible thing wherever you are. I think it's a stronger force than love because it's a kind of love for everyone that is never returned. In that way, maybe it's not so terrible, but a kind of burning power that might give you something back if you have it in you, beaming out. I'm not the kind of person to run away with conspiracy theories, but I can't help but feel like the reason he could see me across the years like that, and really improbably, was because of the force of his loneliness, making a portal or something. I don't know why he should connect with me, if anyone in existence ever. I'm not very interesting or powerful in my day-to-day life or in my imagination. I'd be the last to get picked for a special mission to save the earth, and the first to die in a magical world. A random casualty trampled by a beast or an army. I know that much. But I keep going, and now I keep going knowing that he came to me. Maybe everyone has a visit from a lonely person from the past through their mirrors. I wouldn't be surprised. I'd like the world a bit better if that was the case. So it becomes a study in proximity and distance, right? They're on either side of this mirror. Our narrator thinks, I wish I could just go through there and comfort him, or bring him over here, and he could sleep in the bed, and I'd look after him, and I'd make him soup, or what, you know. But then they think, oh, but isn't there like microbes have evolved since then, right? And maybe if we touched actually, that would make him sick and kill him, or something. How would he survive over here anyway, right? They are thinking sequentially through all of the things that really genuinely, materially and imaginatively separate us from our pasts. And yet there is still a kind of connection. They rhyme with one another through their loneliness. So it becomes a kind of open question about what might be translated from this experience. Is there anything genuinely universal? Anything that connects the life of this medieval figure with this contemporary speaker? And if there is, and it's an open question in the text, it's the horror of a kind of loneliness, right? The horror of a kind of dislocation. And so the story finally ends with the lines, after the the figure in the mirror has faded away. I wonder what he thought about my face, if he liked it. It must have looked strange to him, soft and unfamiliar. When they first encountered the figure in the mirror, they seemed to move strangely. It's a bit of a different diet, right? They have known starvation, they have known hardship in a way that this contemporary figure can't quite identify with. So they move strangely despite being very plainly human. So I must have looked strange to him, soft and familiar, but I hope he thinks for all that it was a good face too, that my company was good for him after so much time alone. It's got me very familiar kind of cupboard in the mirror-fronted wardrobe in the bedroom becomes a terrifying kind of obelisk in this story. But the resources that we've built around a text like this have come up with some discursive projects. Again, these slides are available to you, and some creative ones. So for instance, we want to ask questions, first of all, to make sure that pupils have understood what's the narrator's reaction to finding Mal, that's what he gets called. They can't quite grasp his name when he tries to offer it. They say it's Mal something. And you don't quite trust their memory with it either. But how... what was the narrator's reaction to finding Mal close to how you might handle a similar event? Again, these kind of hypotheticals I think go down really well in the classroom. You're like, right, there's a medieval figure in your mirror. What are you going to do? You know? Do you believe that this time portal experience really happened to this figure in this story, or was it a kind of figment of the imagination? What does it mean to our interpretation of the story either way? Does that really matter? And again, once they've developed an understanding, perhaps we can get into the message of the story. What do you identify as its most important themes or images? Would you describe it as belonging to a particular genre? And our creative and discursive tasks that we put to this, I think, try to reinforce those kinds of readings. So the narrator and Mal something make efforts to speak to one another through their language barriers and the vast differences in the worlds. Write your own short story that features two characters who struggle to communicate with each other. What are the key difficulties they face when communicating, and why do they need to speak to each other in the first place? And then another creative task about a kind of sole survivor kind of narrative. Then we also can open up quite discursive essay topics, I think, by pointing to technology. What role does it have in this short story? Does it connect us, or does it isolate us, or is it a kind of complicated combination of those things? So, conscious of time, and I wanted to leave an opportunity for you guys to ask questions, so I'll begin to wrap up, I think. Those are some sources. I was going to follow a few of these links live, but I don't want to mess up the presentation here. But these are the specific resources that I've been speaking to today. We've also brought along, I don't know if these are available to you already, but if they're not, you can email me and I can send them over. A couple of the resources that we've made more recently, not just the Helen McClory one, but for Nadine Jassat's poem Ante, and for Nan Shepherd's poem Summit at Corey Echakin. So we also have these general repositories, which are totally vital, I think, if you're thinking of teaching more Scottish culture or Scottish literature in your classrooms. The first from the Scottish Qualifications Authority. There's not a ton of resources right there, but what there are the set texts that have just been revived, because we've been working with the SQA to make sure that those are like freely available online, because again, if we're trying to help teachers to have a variety of choices of texts to teach, then if they have to convince their headmaster and their local authority to give them budget to buy 50 copies of a novel, that's going to be harder to do. So instead we're looking at some shorter texts that the copyright could be sort of secured, or they could be, permissions could be secured for them to be shared on their website, and so they have some of those resources there. Similarly, the Scottish Poetry Library is a brilliant resource. It's a massive database of historical and contemporary Scottish poetry, and you can search. You don't need to know what you're looking for to find something useful, if you know what I mean. You don't need to be able to know the name of a poet that you want to look into. You can look up by genre, by themes, by periodization, so, and there's a lot of key terms, kind of hyperlinks that cross-reference everything in this database. So if you like this sort of thing, you might like that sort of thing. Those types of connections that can provide you with primary sources in poetry that you can use freely, and they also have excellent teaching resources on that site as well. Similarly, I think probably one of the most student-oriented resources rather than teacher-oriented is BBC Bite Size, which has all these revision exercises. So again, the material that's up there, these are specific links to the Scottish qualifications and therefore the Scottish texts. But again, these will be getting revived in the coming months and years because of the new curriculum in Scotland. But the resources that are there are really excellent, and there's like little games and quizzes and stuff as well that students can use. So there might be something useful in there for you too. And some other resources from other organisations and partners that we've worked with. I know that Ronnie's going to speak a little bit more about the Association for Scottish Literature momentarily, but they have excellent resources there too. So, again, those slides are shared, so you don't need to scribble all that stuff down. I wanted to close with a couple of quotations. I always use this one in our first year programme to like really dig down into the question of the national paradigm. There's a quotation that is not about Scotland, it's about Colombia by Gabriel Garcia Marquez in his speech accepting the Nobel Prize for Literature. Colombia, just one more, or Scotland, is just one more cipher singled out by fortune. So a concession that this thing we call Scotland is arbitrary in a sense, right? It exists because of a whole bunch of historical contingencies. And it won't exist forever, but it's here for a while. And that's as it is and as it should be. So that's a qualifier for us to understand in the broadest terms. He moves from there, our crucial problem has been a lack of conventional means to render our lives believable. This, my friends, is the crux of our solitude. Of course, Marquez, solitude being one of his animating themes. But this idea that if in literature we might glimpse a conventional means to render our lives believable to one another, then that's something that ought to be manifest at the most intimate and personal level, as in the short story from Helen McClory and this lonely figure in their bedroom, encountering the past in their mirror, with all the freighted meanings that represents, right? What does it mean to encounter your past by really looking at yourself in the mirror? Right up to the scale of geopolitics of a national imagination, as in Momus's Book of Scotland's. Conventional means to render our lives believable. That's what we lack, and that's the cause of our solitude. If we can really believe the fact of one another's lives at the level of nations and individuals, we can perhaps get somewhere that can overcome that loneliness to some degree. And finally, close out a quotation from contemporary Scottish writer A.L. Kennedy on receipt of the Heinrich Heine Prize in 2016, which is awarded to writers and artists who advocate for and work in the interests of universal human rights. And after quoting Heine, and I was going to try to read it in the original, but I butchered the pronunciation and I'd feel really embarrassed, so I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to pick up where she ends after having read a few lines from Heine. As artists, writers and artists, we serve the dreams that come to us to be expressed. We make them articulate and let them join the larger dreams that others make for us, the dreams that form our culture. Our culture makes the reality we inhabit. Again, this point I opened with, this idea that we imagine our way to it, it finds a kind of reality in that conjuring, if you like, the kind of magic. As artists, as writers, we are paid to dream awake, and that's very nice for us. As human beings, which is more important, we have a duty never to forget those secret words we hear in darkness, and to guard each other from the worst of who we can be, the worst of worlds that we can make, and to do better. And we can love that, and we can love that loudly. So thank you very much for your time today.